Hey, it's Jordan. Delighted to be joined by Matthew Solomon, a filmmaker who now has a really, really interesting film out, I think, long overdue, called Reimagining Safety. And it kind of thoughtfully using about 10 experts in law enforcement, social justice, actual safety measures, examines the aftermath of the George Floyd protests and kind of what it actually looks like to keep us safe. Obviously, defund the police, what abolition means, etc. Very different than the narratives we see on cable news and elsewhere. Let's start with the basics. You've been a filmmaker for a long time. I understand you went back to school kind of during the worst of COVID. Mm-hmm. What kind of got you interested in exploring this topic?
Well, I've kind of always been interested in this topic. My filmmaking work before was all scripted, so this is the first time I've done a documentary. And basically, growing up in LA, I just turned 50, so born in the 70s, went to school in the 80s. I had what I discovered was a unique experience going to very integrated, diverse schools. And so growing up, most of my friends weren't white, and so I observed at an early age that most of my friends were treated differently by the police, were treated differently when we went to the mall or in stores, that sort of thing. And then, fast forward to the early 90s, I was at University of Southern California School of Music, and the Rodney King beating happened. And so that was the first time for me that it was like blatantly like on TV that, these white officers beating, this black man that they had pulled over. And then those officers were acquitted, when it was like, of course they're going to, be convicted. And that didn't happen. And so the Rodney King beating, the LA riots, there was a scandal with the Rampart Division, which was the gang unit, a few years after that. And when I was in music school, I was taking sociology classes because I was always very interested in societies and, why things are the way they are, with societies, religion, all of that. And so I had a professor who said one time, we were talking about systemic racism. She said, the laws in a society are written and enforced by the people in power to keep them in power. And so that's something that just kind of stuck with me. And so then I went into music, and then I got into film. And, when Trayvon Martin was murdered and George Zimmerman got off, it was like, wow, we did that with Rodney King. How are we still doing this? And then the Black Lives Matter movement and, the procession, as Jodie Armour says in the film, the procession of hashtags, like all these events caught on, cell phone cameras keep happening. And then we hit the pandemic, can't go anywhere, and George Floyd is murdered. And, it's such a, blatant, horrific event caught on video. And so, I had gone back to school and I thought I was done with filmmaking, actually. I wanted to get into, I got a master's in public administration degree. I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but figured it would be something along the lines of government, policy making, politics, somewhere that I could use my privilege and my access as a cis hetero white male to help support social change. And so I was in my coursework applying the public administration stuff around sustainability, policy making, transformative leadership, applying all of that to really exploring the issues with policing and incarceration. And I was clear that it wasn't working and wasn't equitably keeping people safe. But I wanted to know, well, what's on the other side then? What do we replace it with? How do we approach safety? And so that was, what I was doing in my coursework. And then when it came time to do my thesis at the end, one of my academic advisors was like, we know you can write a paper. We also know you were a filmmaker. Why don't you do a creative project and make a film, make a documentary or something? And so that's kind of how this all came about. And so, I did that, and it became more, it's almost 1,000 people have seen the film since February. at community impact screenings across the country.
Right. And, you know, what's interesting to me from a political perspective is, honestly, the George Floyd protests was the first time in my experience, I've been doing this for a decade or so, that you saw such a mass mobilization across the board. I mean, young, old, you know, black, white, just across the board, millions of people. And in some cases, you know, people were protesting for a year. You look at Portland, I think they went strong for a year. And honestly, maybe it was a little naive on my part. Others, I really thought something's got to give here. But you look about 2.5, 3 years later, and there's more money federally towards police. And I think political narratives that have been injected, kind of distorting why crime has risen, all but negated. You know, I don't want to say negated, but really kind of neutralized that movement. Did you explore that at all in the film?
Did I explore that? That's interesting. I know the DA of Los Angeles County, George Gascon, he talks about, I had asked him why, you know, we're so committed to policing and incarceration, you know, and he talks about the intersection of politics, fear, and money. And says, he's like, I fear that we're in the same place now that we were in the 70s when the whole like mass incarceration, war on drugs thing happened. And so, and Nikki Black, who's in the film, she's a sociologist from Inglewood. She actually, in her own work, talks a lot about what you're talking about, how like we all posted our black squares, you know, summer of 2020. And she's like, now what are you doing? You know, you read your books, now what? You know? And so I think, like, you know, people, especially black people in the movement kind of predicted that, you know, this, you know, all the support, you know, movement would kind of die off. There's still a lot of us in the movement though. Right. I think a lot of us got mobilized and are still in it, but it's not the same numbers. But yeah, it's, you know, it's frustrating, but it's like you mentioned with the politics of it. And that was something that came up in my coursework, was kind of charting the history of Black liberation and then the swift backlash, you know, from politicians and people in power and the wealthy elites and all of that. And so like every gain, there's this big pushback. So we had this support, you know, after George Floyd, and then everything got politicized against defunding the police without even getting to talk about what it was. And then here comes the criticism of critical race theory, which none of what they're saying is actually what it is, and it's not where it's at. And then, you know, going forward to, you know, ending oh shoot, I'm drawing a blank. In, you know, the universities, the affirmative action, right? All of that is backlash to the post George Floyd support and protests, right? And a lot of where we are is backlash to Obama being elected, you know? Right. So, you know, just being aware of that, I think is important. And, you know, what I found with this film is a lot of the folks that I know who are, you know, identify as white liberals, who were like, yeah, we know there's a problem, but I'm afraid of defund the police, and I don't know what to say about it, and who do we call? And then they see the film and they're like, oh, I get it now. And literally they told me, yeah, I went and I talked to my mom about it, or I talked to my uncle or my friends, and it's you know, that was something that we didn't really get to have, was the discussion around, well, what does defund the police mean? And most people, Gina Viola in the film ran for mayor of Los Angeles. She talks about when she was canvassing, you know, and campaigning, like she would talk to people and they would be like, yeah, we know like there's problems with policing. We know communities need to be resourced, but when it, you know, and so the idea of it, people get on board with, but the term and the phrase has been so demonized, you know, propagandized by the politicians and the media, that, you know, it's hard to push that forward without educating people.
Yeah, kind of similar. I see parallels between gun control versus, gun safety per se,
Right.
things like that. Could you kind of talk about, because we saw on the trailer really thorough explanations, thoughtful explanations for
Mhm.
defund, what that means, abolition. I think, unfortunately, on the journalistic end, I learned a long time ago, it doesn't really matter if you have gold in the story. We live in a short attention span. If you don't
Mhm.
catch them in the headline, maybe the first paragraph, they're going elsewhere.
Yeah.
Did you kind of, you know, was there exploration of different ways of kind of explaining what they mean by defund, abolition, and how to, I don't want to say change the core of it, but
Mhm.
make it less scary to the kind of the comfortable white suburban wine mom?
Yeah. Well, I think, because it comes up a lot of times. Like people are like, yeah, we shouldn't call it that. But for me, especially again as a white male, I think that um, there's nothing wrong with the phrase and the terms, right? Those came from people who are on the ground in the movement, who have been in these liberation movements for a long time. The problem that I see is, not only are we as as a whole not educated as to what that means. And it is, you talk about short attention span. It's easy to say, oh, well, I'm not into defund the police because, whatever, because it's easier, right? Because then I don't have to deal with it. But if we're really talking about the policy and what it is, and it's basic, and it's funding, it's investing in people, it's funding communities, it's, housing and clothes and food, jobs, that sort of thing. I think that the more that our elected officials and media personalities understand what it is and being willing to push back, because on the right, they can just say anything and they'll hold the line with whatever that is, whatever they're demonizing, and it's hard to fight against unless we're doing the same thing, unless we're saying, like Mariam Kaba says in We Do This Till We Free Us, yes, we absolutely mean abolish the police, and here's why, and here's what it means. So I think there really just needs to be more conviction, on the part of those of us fighting for that systemic change more than anything. Because the more, confident and grounded and unified that we are, versus what we usually do on the left, which is we just get defensive and then we want to avoid the whole thing, and then
Yeah.
everybody loses. So I think that's more the issue from what I've observed. Doing these screenings and having panelists and having these conversations.
And what would you say? Obviously, we're two white dudes. I would
Mhm.
assume, anyone could enjoy and learn from the film, but hopefully, more white folks would get something out of it,
Mhm.
particularly those that have been propagandized that,
Yeah.
you know, you guys are calling for anarchy. What are you hoping or do you expect if folks give the film a chance, particularly those a little suspicious of the terms,
Mhm.
can learn from it?
Well, a couple things, and this is what came up for me in the interviews. Like, I didn't go in knowing this, but when people are talking about abolishing the police, right? Sounds like a scary term, abolish the police. They're really talking about a long-term process of changing how we relate to one another. And it's not, we get rid of police and prisons tomorrow and everybody's just running in the streets. It's, we need to learn how to communicate. We need to learn how to resolve conflicts without calling the police for everything. But it's also, for me, and this connects to work that I do in my conflict resolution work, which is, if we really cared about one another, we would do things differently. Right now, and we're so inundated with punishment and revenge, and it's easy to just say, oh, they did it, they committed a crime, lock them up. Oh, they did this thing, let's take them out of society, which Jody Armour said, if we locked up everybody who's ever committed a crime, 90% of us would be in jail. So it's abolition through this process for me is really about like caring about each other. And if we care enough to look into, well, all right, this particular community is dealing with poverty issues. What do they need? You know, they need more resources. It's said several times in the film, the safest communities have the most resources, not the most police. So it's really shifting our view of how we see each other and ourselves, and, you know, doing our own, you know, inner work, you know, recognizing like why we are so committed to revenge instead of, you know, being invested in the collective, and helping each other. And so it's a long-term thing, which L. Jones in the film says, you know, this isn't going to happen in our lifetime, you know, the end result, and we can take the steps to get there. So for me, it's really about, you know, caring for each other and recognizing that we all deserve to be safe. We all deserve to be taken care of. Most of the time, people that are committing what we label as crimes are crimes of, you know, poverty and, you know, things that stem from that, you know, poverty, mental health issues. Yeah.
I think that's an important point. I'm not sure how much it's dissected in the film, but you will never hear a deep dive on cable news or the New York Times about, well, why is there such an increase in petty theft and, you know, nonviolent crimes? Well, maybe because we have rampant income inequality. We live in a economic Hunger Games, and there's a bit of a Gilded Age. You know, it's not to defend stealing or theft or anything like that, but at the end of the day, if people are being continually priced out, pushed out of their communities, you know, inflation, gentrification, which I view as a form of kind of economic terrorism. Yeah, you might have enhanced crime, and that might even become more violent crime. Obviously, there's just people who commit crimes because they commit crimes, but you don't really see, well, why has there's not much of an examination in broader mainstream media on why has there been such an increase in these nonviolent crimes, because that's kind of the model for the mainstream media, to ignore the root of it.
Yeah, it's, you know, it's fascinating. Several years ago, I watched a documentary by Stacy Peralta called Crips and Bloods Made in America. And it was the origin of the Crips and Bloods gangs here in Los Angeles. And the short version is that South Central LA at one point was a thriving Black community with industry and movie theaters and restaurants and, you know, music and culture and all of that. And then the auto industry left, and, you know, all these folks were left without jobs. And then there was the drugs were sent into those communities. And so they started, you know, heavily policing, locking people up, arresting people, killing people. And the kids of these fathers who were either locked up or murdered didn't have anywhere to go. They couldn't join the Boy Scouts because the Boy Scouts were segregated and wouldn't let Black people in. So these kids, you know, and there weren't after school programs. So they were basically, you know, on the streets, joining, you know, formed clubs in their neighborhoods, which became the gangs. And then the gang wars and everything that erupted in the 80s and 90s was all, you can tie it back to the poverty, lack of resources, racist policies, and you know, kids not having anywhere to go, like not being able to literally go somewhere after school and, you know, learn, hang out, and whatnot. And so, you know, a big thing for me has been, you know, reshaping like what we call crime. Why do we call certain things crime? Why do, you know, in the 90s there was the drug wars and the gang wars and all of that, but then there was the savings and loan scandals, you know, where the guys who committed, you know, billions of dollars in fraud, you know, they went to like a country club prison. You know.
And also, I mean, you barely hear anything about the massive crime, which was all this fraud during COVID, where people abused the, you know, small business PPP program, were just hoarding cash that really belonged to real small businesses, like millionaires were doing this. I saw a Rolling Stone piece on it, but other than that, it seems the white collar corporate crime is just kind of another day in America, whereas, you know, poverty porn, shoplifting and carjackings,
Yeah.
that is amplified.
And then the people that get demonized are, those folks, and then people on, with food stamps and public assistance and student loans, which is just this minuscule, minimal, part of, monetarily compared to like all the folks with the PPP loans.
And I would be derelict without asking you. Obviously, we see Atlanta right now. There is a militarized police compound being rammed through Cop City. You've had an environmental protester killed. You have, at this point, I believe 20 to 30 nonviolent protesters that have been charged with domestic terrorism on, from everything I could tell, very flimsy charges. A lot of them have been detained for weeks and months. The Democratic Party has said nothing. No surprise, the Republicans have said nothing. And there are many knockoffs now being proposed in other places of this. I don't expect that that's in the film since that's more recent, but that's obviously a graver threat, because it seems that we now have, obviously, prisons are big business in many ways, but they're now kind of creating these police compounds guised under training.
That all happened after the film was completed. I will say, before this, years ago, I had the opportunity to I participated in role-playing exercises at the LA County Sheriff's Department for their academy, their Sheriff's Department Academy. And, I was like, they would bring people in to help train the people in the academy. So I would either be like a victim, or I would be, a suspect or whatever. And they would practice, interrogating and doing all their stuff. And so I got to see the training, and, it's all command and control. I remember, I was supposed to be like this guy who was, just walking on the side of the freeway, and I could come up with whatever scenario, that put me there. And, everything, like, I remember like one of the deputies almost like interlocked my fingers and like almost broke my fingers, and it was, I found out later, and actually through the process of this film, that in police academies across the country, on the average, there's 60 hours of firearms training and only 8 hours of de-escalation training. And that, what they call that training, comes at the very end, after they've been programmed with, shoot, control, do what I tell you. There's this thing called command presence, which is, when you show up, you're the one in charge, and nobody can, take that power away from you. And so, being willing to fight at the drop of a hat, being willing to, get violent at the drop of a hat. And then at the end, it's like, okay, what are you going to do in this situation? If somebody needs help. And so, Alex Vitale talks about this in the film and in his book, End of Policing. So much of that culture is about, you do what we tell you to do. We're the ones in charge. And if you don't, it escalates. And we see it, on the cell phone camera footage all the time. There's no de-escalation that happens. It's always like, it always just shoots up really quick, from zero to, somebody being beaten or killed or, something violent very quickly. And so, that's something that, when we look at like these training camps, like you're talking about, right, where they're being trained in better urban assault tactics, which I was talking to one of my kids about this, because he was like, well, don't cops need better training? And I'm like, training for what? Training to get better at corralling and killing people? No, they're pretty good with that. How about training with how to talk to people and find out what somebody needs and get them their needs, which is not part of their training.
Right. Absolutely. Tell people, when is the film available? Where could they find it? All the info.
Yeah, thank you. So right now we're working on getting a distribution for the film, so it's more widely publicly available. In the meantime, we're doing community screenings and film festivals. And so you can follow us at reimaginingsafetymovie.com and or on Instagram at Reimagining Safety Movie. And, you know, I post updates all the time. We're going to be in Los Angeles, August 18th, Seattle, September 2nd, Sacramento, September 22nd. We'll be back out on the East Coast. We were just in Montclair, New Jersey. We had 90 people present. We're going to be back out on the East Coast soon. So you can follow us there. And if you're watching and you want to have a screening in your area, you can also contact me through the website. And that's how we've been setting these up. People contact me and they're like, we want to do a screening in Denver, Colorado. And then we'll, you know, work together to get that set up.
And I should say the press reviews I was looking on the website have been pretty positive. So yeah, it seems that people really are taking a positive note from this. So I look forward to a wider distribution, and everybody should check out the trailer and more info, reimaginingsafetymovie.com. Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.